Monsters and creatures are undoubtedly one of the most fun things that there is to draw. They're just exciting to dive into. Many of us started, I think, in our youth, copying from video games and movies and other things. I loved Power Rangers as a kid, and the monster designs, although sometimes very strange, were really intriguing, and I enjoyed working from them. Godzilla was another one, as well as a lot of the Marvel comics and some of the stranger bad guys that showed up in those. But I also played a lot of video games as a kid, and running into just bizarre creatures that were, two parts interesting and one part horrifying were just wonderful additions to my childhood. And I bring this up because many of us get a lot of joy out of designing, building, and drawing creatures. At least we used to. A lot of us, though, as we get older, as we start to get more fancy with the things that we do artistically, if we try to formalize our education or the kind of work we do in any way, we tend to step away from those kinds of things, from monsters and creatures. And so in this drawing today, I'm actually working on something that is quite a bit different than a lot of my creature drawing, which is I'm taking multiple things and putting them together into a single being. Now, often I look up references and I work through those references to do lots of different things, even on the drawing that you can see on the opposite page. Like I looked up some bones and other things, but a lot of those things I've drawn enough that they float around in my head in close to accurate enough places that I'm able to utilize them. But for this prompt, which was another from Smogist, it was arthropod. And so I looked up a whole bunch of different arthropods and kind of came up with the conclusion of taking pieces of a grasshopper, pieces of a scorpion, and pieces of a praying mantis and putting them together in something that is kind of dragon-esque in the way that it's put together. And that leads us to right now, where I've already put down the pencil sketch and I'm starting to work on actually building out the creature. I know that it's a little difficult to see my pencil lines on here because I optimized the video for the ink, but if you'll bear with me for just a moment, most of what the pencil lines are indicating to me is where all the shapes are going. Predominantly, it's to keep me from accidentally working over top of myself, which ironically I did yesterday because I wasn't thinking and planning thoroughly enough. So I actually managed to draw lines where they didn't need to be and had to go back over them with acrylic white. So the sketch not being particularly visible is not that important. It's far more to just indicate which shapes overlap other shapes so I know which ones to work on first or which spaces to leave blank. But I have references up. You can't see them right now. They're right in front of this, and sometimes you'll see my hand move forward and it's going in between some of the references that I've selected. You can obviously watch the kind of grasshopper-y bits come into being right now at the beginning, but that's pretty easy. It's easy to pull up a reference and to work on executing that. Obviously, those skills have to be built. If you haven't been drawing very long, working from reference can still be rather difficult, but it's a very learnable skill. It's probably one of the most learnable things that there is with art, is learning how to translate from one thing into another thing. It's difficult to stylize, it's difficult to build from your imagination, but it's not altogether difficult learning how to work from reference. It just takes a lot of time. And there are actually a lot of strategies such as gridding or measuring that are going to give you the ability to do it more accurately in the learning stages. And if you'd be interested in anything like that, just let me know in the comments below, because I taught that content to middle and high school for a long time and could very easily and happily put it together here. But the parts that I'm focusing on today is the combination of these things. Obviously, I'm not finding references that are for the thing I'm putting together. There are no references to my knowledge unless you're going to use AI, and that's a whole other can of worms, to find a half grasshopper, half praying mantis sort of critter. And I'm not copying everything specifically either. So I'm finding references that give me angles that are translatable. I'm finding references that are giving me the detail that I need in order to construct what I want. And then I'm slowly trying to build things up and think about how this creature would function, and then put those details together. Now on this creature design, I'm not really going super in depth. I'm not thinking about ecologically where this creature exists. I will do that in some future sessions, where I will be designing creatures very specifically to fill niches and to be a part of a greater ecosystem. This is more of a fun drawing, but I'm still thinking about how all of the parts combine, because if I just slap the legs on there, it won't necessarily make sense. You'll notice that the joints for those forelimbs kind of make sense. They're nestled right underneath the neck in a place that they would be nestled if this was a grasshopper, although the limb is a little bit different. And the face isn't exactly grasshopper either. It's got some traits that I pulled from some geckos, because of course this is supposed to be a dragon. All of this to say that when you are trying to create a creature, and you're doing so by combining other features from other things, try to think about which pieces you can pull in and how they're going to interact with one another. And experiment a lot. About half the time I do this, it doesn't turn out in a particularly palatable way. I kind of like how this drawing turned out, but just because things are highly detailed, it doesn't feel like it has quite the gravitas that I wanted. And yet, a drawing like this I still find pleasure in, because the drawing, the copying, the monotony is fun for me. It's enjoyable. And it's also just good to see a thing through. But as I'm taking all these pieces, the first thing that I have to do is I have to figure out which pieces I'm taking from which resource. This is really good practice if you just don't know what to draw, or if you want to get into some manner of creature design for yourself in the future. Try selecting several animals and just arbitrarily pick pieces of those and try to think about how you can combine them together. I could have done this very differently, right? I could have done the actual head of a gecko. I could have done the back limbs of a lizard. I could have done the tail like I'm going to here, where it's the tail of a scorpion and things like that. But I could have assembled this in a lot of different ways. And each one of those drawings is going to teach me things about those forms and about the animals themselves. The forms is mostly contemplating how each of these shapes interacts with one another, so it doesn't look like they're totally divergent. If I did have the legs of an actual gecko on here, they would feel very out of place because everything is so segmented. But there's probably ways that I could deal with that. I could have spikes and scales coming out from behind the eyes that would actually kind of approximate some of that segmentation, and then the legs could come right underneath that. And potentially you could still have an underbody that just looked like a normal reptile underbody. But you have to experiment, and you have to play, and you have to find a way not to limit yourself so much, because when you're experimenting like this, when you're learning, when you're trying new things, inevitably things aren't going to work out every time. This is one of 30 dragon drawings that I did over the course of that month, and there are a couple in there that I really don't like. There's only one that's like bad, but there are certainly others that I'm just not a fan of. This one's kind of middle of the road. The one on the opposite page was probably my favorite out of the whole bunch, but there's a couple that were really good, and then there's a bunch that are like this, where it's like, I'm glad I did the drawing, but it's not my favorite work. And that happens. If you look at these 30 creature design prompts that I worked on over the month of August, that's probably a good ratio for you as an artist as well to think about. As you go on, that ratio will increase, the quantity of pieces out of a given bunch that you enjoy, that you feel like they turned out well. But I'm not sure that you will ever get to a point, nor should it be your expectation to get to a point where every single piece turns out the way you want it to. Pieces will likely continue to improve and get better, but as your skills improve, so too do your eyes at pulling out the indiscrepancies, the things that are bad, the things that are not achieving what you want them to. So your drawings will improve, but so too will your ability to nitpick your own drawings. So you got to be gracious with yourself. You have to be kind, because otherwise this long, arduous journey becomes something that is unmanageable and very difficult to stick to. But alas, I pulled myself into another tangent. So going back to the prior point, you should expect that some are going to turn out better than others. And you should also be prepared for some of those pieces to turn out poorly. And don't let that get you down. Don't let that stop your progress, because every piece, even a poorly done piece, a piece that you're not happy with, that you don't want to show anyone, and trust me, the one that I really don't like out of this bunch is only going to show up in the sketchbook tour, because I don't want to put it anywhere else, because I don't particularly like it. And conversely, I don't think that it's going to give a whole lot of benefit to anyone who sees it here. It's not that I'm going to hide it, it's just that it's not going to be beneficial to show it. Expect those. Expect that a piece here and there will not turn out. And if you're just getting started, especially if you're just getting started drawing and creature designing, things are not going to turn out a lot of the time. And you should be spending a lot of your time working from reference. If you want to draw dragons, then work from lizards, work from other people's drawings of dragons, work from snakes. And after you do a little bit of that reference work, then come back to your sketchbook and try to draw something from your own mind. Those first drawings are going to be bad unless you've got some very natural skill or you've been at this for a while. But inevitably, they will improve. If you stick to the task, then you will improve. It's one of the lovely things about art is that it is a learnable skill predominantly. I talked in one of the recent podcasts about the fact that I'm not sure you can teach art, but it is 100% learnable. So I'm not sure that I can give you 7 tips that are going to make you a better artist. However, I can give you tips that point you in the right direction. You can go practice things, and then through your hard work, your analysis, your introspection, and your practice, you can improve. I really do fundamentally believe everyone can learn to draw at a basic level. I'm 100% certain that everyone who has the fine motor skills to do it can learn to draw from reference. But I really do think that most people are actually capable of learning how to draw from imagination as well, as long as they're willing to put in the time. And it is a lot of time. So you got to find ways to enjoy it too. And for me, on a drawing like this, I love animals. I love creatures. It's part of what got me into drawing in the first place. And I love bugs and insects so much. So getting to spend a couple hours drawing a praying mantis and a scorpion tail and the grasshopper, like these are awesome. If I could get paid to just draw grasshoppers for the rest of my life, I'd probably be pretty content. Maybe at some point I'd get bored of just drawing grasshoppers, but there are a lot of different grasshoppers in the world. And there's something about learning a single thing so intimately that is really rewarding. So if you are starting to dive into creature design of any kind, I would highly recommend that you start with the animals that you like the most, or at least base things off of those. There's a couple people in my community on the Discord, which there's a link below if you'd like to check it out, that are very focused on dragons, or were at least for Smogist. And one of them in particular I'm thinking about spends a lot of time working with horses and has over the course of their life. Well, horses then have a very strong link to the dragons that this particular artist draws. If you look at the movie How to Train Your Dragon, a lot of those dragons are based off of cats. So you can create a fantasy creature, something that doesn't exist in our world, and base it off of something that does, and you're giving it those traits. Sometimes those traits are physical. They actually control what the animal looks like. And sometimes they're more like in How to Train Your Dragon, where it's how that animal moves, its mannerisms, how it functions. There's even the scene where it finds like the cat grass substitute, the dragon grass, I guess it would be, and it acts just like a kitty. So, and I now have a cat for the first time in my life, so watching those kind of things, like, oh, this is really entertaining. And I can see that in a lot of fantasy scenarios, dragons are modeled off of some kind of idea of another animal, or they're just like humans in reptilian form. But evidently horses and cats are a pretty common way to channel that reptilian draconic energy. So I would encourage you, if you're starting to work on creature design, you have a desire to do that, you think that would be fun, or you already have fun doing it, try to figure out how to focus on the animals that you enjoy. If you're like me and you enjoy scaly things and things with lots of legs, then I would just focus on those areas. Maybe initially work just from reference, try to figure out what the natural traits are of those things as you continue to work on reference, and then eventually start trying to construct those animals on your own. I am not yet at a point where I can do all of this without any reference. So even though you're watching this drawing come into being, which I find to be a fairly mediocre drawing, but there's a good chance that some of you are going to look at this and be like, I can't do this. This is so far beyond my skill. Well, just know that I have probably 6 references up in front of me. I sketched it first. I do practice sketches often in a secondary sketchbook. I'm not trying to hide any of this. In fact, on some sessions, I show all these pieces. But don't have the illusion that I am just assembling this thing from my brain. It just is simply not happening. This is the product of a lot of prep work, and it's the product of years of focusing on these things. But even at that point, I am still not capable of doing something this detailed entirely from imagination or memory. So don't be so hard on yourself. There's nothing wrong with using references. Some of you might think of them as a crutch, but even if that's the case, a crutch is used until you don't need it anymore. So even if you can't deconstruct that, you still think of using references as a crutch. Well, if you are a beginner or if you're in your early stages, use the crutch. Just don't feel like you're going to be perceived as a better artist if you get rid of the crutch, because those of us who have been at it for a while know that there's no shame in using references. There's no shame in using help, in tracing something you did effectively onto another resource. These are things that are just part of the process. So use the resources that you have. Use the help that you can get. These things are important. Well, I think perhaps I've rambled enough. This is a little bit longer session, but I wanted to talk about some of the processes here in how I'm constructing this thing, how it's coming together. As we move forward with the channel, I'll be doing more videos that are like this. And I will continue to have my rambles, so if you have anything you'd like to hear me ramble about, feel free to leave that in the comments below. I would happily take that in and put that into a future session. And I'm also going to be doing videos that are specifically on parts of how to draw. Less conceptual, but more on how to actually know which way to hatch a thing, how to lay down your first initial layers of ink. So if you've got anything you'd like to see, I would love to hear about that in the comments as well. Anyway, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you being here, watching, commenting, and being a part of the community. The Discord server is linked down below. If you want to check out the Patreon, there's a link to that as well. And in that vein, thank you to patron Who, What, Where, When for your continued support, and to all my other patrons who allow me to keep doing this here. It's a wonderful thing. I've started putting up more frequent private videos just for the Patreon that are, sketchbook tours or what I'm working on right now, a little bit of my world building sketchbook. So those things are there if you'd like to check it out. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.